Агресор, який напав і при тому просто блокує можливість розгляду цього питання своїм правом. Це те, що потребує вирішення зараз.
Ну, крім морального авторитету пана Гутерреша, ніяких інших важелів на перший погляд у нього немає.
Те, з чого ми маємо почати, це насправді з саботажу участі Росії в системі міжнародних організацій.
ООН не впоралась, вона не захистила нас, вона не допомогла подолати агресію.
Hello and welcome to Ukrainian Flames, a special project by Ukraine Media Center and Euro-Atlantic Course NGO. My name is Lesa Bidochko. Today we'll talk about how Russia is turning international organizations into facade and they fail to perform their main functions. If you want to know more, please subscribe to our channel to stay tuned. Russia-Ukraine war, the largest one since the World War II, evidenced the powerlessness and ineffectiveness of most of the international organizations whose main goal is to prevent and stop the hostilities. Post-Helsinki international system of relations has collapsed. Organizations whose charters are devoted to the prevention of military conflict today are simply limited to lip service resolutions. As long as Russia is a member of these organizations with the power of blocking vote, there is no sense in their activities. Now the world community questions the feasibility of Russia's membership in numerous international organizations and treaties. Definitely, the state of affairs does not meet official Kyiv's interests. For Ukraine, it's essential to promote the idea of isolating the aggressor state and turning it into pariah state in the near future. How to achieve it? And what trials await Ukraine along the way? Ukraine Media Center organized an expert discussion amongst high diplomats and influencers. I'm honored to have the privilege to introduce our first guest speaker, Valeriy, Ukraine's ambassador to US in 2015-2019. Ambassador Charlie presented his own vision on how to deprive Russia of the opportunity to block consideration of issues related to its own actions.
По ООН.
Let us proceed to the UN. It is important to understand that there are medium-term perspectives and current tasks for today. More than 100,000 signatures have been collected around the world for the exclusion of Russia from the United Nations Security Council. First of all, we are talking about the deprivation of the right of veto. The aggressor that attacks and simultaneously blocks the possibility of considering this issue is nonsense. This should be addressed now. It has already undergone the General Assembly. The first decision has already been made. A very long way is still ahead. Therefore, it is necessary to ask a radical question. Can the country simply have the right of veto today in such conditions? I am not even talking about the legal mechanism, but purely a political question. If we talk now how many countries will support it, I think it is definitely more than NATO, the EU and their allies. We achieved this together on the issue of Crimea. More than 100 countries voted for that resolution, and this so-called UN 100 is the minimum number of countries that can stand on our side. Crimean platform and all the other resolutions corroborate that it can be increased. It works if you ask the question in the right way. Therefore, the task is urgent to deprive Russia of the opportunity to block consideration of issues related to its actions. How can we do it? This is a matter of legal mechanisms. Second, there are some countries, for example, Poland and Lithuania, which are more active than we are. Despite our official position, now they are more decisive in excluding the official contacts with Russia. I am convinced that different international organizations can do it in its war, but it's good that we are their members. I will mention, for example, the Organization of American States. Mr. Yelchenko and I were Ukraine's representatives here, so we had to pay some small fee from the budget, $20,000, with Minister Klimkin's participation. We had an observer status and took an active part in the organization's activity. Russia entered later, and they were quickly kicked out of there. That is, there are symbolic steps, and there are 54 countries. Yes, Venezuela was against it, but almost all the countries of North and South America voted for us. So there are such important symbolic steps that will deprive Russia of a permanent appeal that they are allegedly reputable all over the world.
Volodymyr Yelchenko, permanent representative of Ukraine to UN and Ukraine's multi-time ambassador, pointed historical examples which should be used as a case for isolating Russia in all possible senses.
Ця тема, вона дуже складна, вона комплексна.
This topic is very complex and challenging, which is why in recent decades no one wanted to deal with it. Even before the beginning of the active phase of the war, the invasion of Russia on February 24, there were challenges in the world that made some countries think about whether Russia is worse and deserves to preserve the status which it has had since December 1991. I mean in the system of international organizations, starting with the United Nations. When speaking about the United Nations, ordinary citizens and even experts often imagine the United Nations as a super organization that governs the entire world. In fact, the United Nations consists of 193 countries members. And those who think of the UN as something big and high, they mean the United Nations Secretariat or the United Nations Secretary General. Allegedly, they are supposed to do something like that and should do it, but nothing is done. In fact, apart from the moral authority of Mr. Guterres, he does not have any other leverage at first glance. All the powers of the United Nations Secretary-General and the United Nations as an organization are rooted in the mandates given to them by the United Nations General Assembly or the United Nations Security Council. It is more difficult with the General Assembly because its decisions are not binding, although they have moral force and authority because there is a large number of states involved. Maybe not all 193 countries do it. Let us remember when Russia was actually kicked out of the United Nations Human Rights Council, and there were 141 votes for it. This is a very serious number, 3/4. It involves a lot of countries in other regions. Their support does not come to us automatically. And this is important if we are talking about the hypothetical possibility of excluding Russia from the UN Security Council. We need to understand that it depends not only on the 28 EU countries or the 30 NATO countries, plus the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. These are our traditional allies who will always be on our side. But there are a number of countries in the world, the same BRICS. There are large regional countries that are targeted in almost every region. It is Egypt or South Africa in Africa. It is Brazil or Mexico in Latin America. It is Indonesia. And it is very important, by the way, that the visit of the president of Indonesia to Ukraine took place. It came quite unnoticed. But the point is not only that Indonesia chairs the Great 20, and not even whether Putin will or not be invited to the summit of G20. The fact is that Indonesia is a country on which at least 40 or 45 other Asian countries depend. We need to understand that any global decision that, if not expelling Russia from the United Nations, will gradually limit its rights. it must be supported if we rely on the General Assembly by no less than 2/3 of the countries. There is an example of the exclusion of Taiwan. Then it was not Taiwan, but the Republic of China in 1971, and instead the inclusion of the People's Republic of China, as we know it today. There was exclusion both from the United Nations and from permanent membership in the Security Council. That is, it is an automatic deprivation of the right of veto. And for this, 2/3 of the votes were needed. In 1971, it was, of course, fewer countries, but that decision gained this number. And we will be able to take advantage of this episode, if it comes to that, because in principle, such a number is real. But for this, of course, it is necessary to work with third world countries.
Pavlo Klimkin, Ukraine's foreign minister in 2014-2019, underlined the urgent need in taking radical measures. Ukraine should sabotage Russia's participation in the system of international organizations, initiate the process of its exclusion. For this, it's essential to find allies among Western countries and regional leaders.
Системи вже ніякої
If I
немає.
may say, there is no longer system anymore. It used to exist in the classical sense. It was built after the Second World War. It started with the United Nations, then the Council of Europe appeared, and then the OSCE, previously known as CSCE. Now there is no system. And if there is no system, it is easier to break it. The problem is that today there is no political consensus regarding the exclusion of Russia from any system of international organizations. There are different reasons for it. It's not a matter of sympathy. Sympathy is a matter of past. But there is someone's desire to use the existing system, to use the role of Russia in this very system. Therefore, we should start by sabotaging Russia's participation in the system of international organizations. In the near future, we should not expect the decision to exclude Russia from sectoral organizations such as ICAO and the IAEA, as they are considered critical for global security issues. And here the membership is not determined whether it is good or bad. They accept both good and bad participants there. System of the United Nations is turning into a system of arranging political and personal interests, redistribution of funds, etc. It is necessary to understand that we must increasingly and as efficiently as possible sabotage those decisions that are important for Russia. This requires coalitions, sometimes situational, sometimes permanent. We should build coalitions, first of all, with Western and Asian countries. The situation in Africa is more complicated, but nevertheless, there are still many countries that could not be called Russia's friends, the same does Latin America. Basically, I am a supporter of the radical approach. I stand for raising our stakes in order to, if not destroy, this system. Unfortunately, there is no consensus on this. At the very least, it should be rebooted.
Alexander Merezhko, Ukrainian MP and chairman of the Parliamentary Committee on Foreign Policy, suggests that Ukraine should not recognize Russia as a member of the UN because it had no legal grounds to take the place of the Soviet Union in this organization. Let us hear in more details.
Ми зараз в основному
We are now questioning how to exclude Russia from the United Nations and other international organizations. If we are talking about the United Nations, if I would put the question in a slightly different way, that what are the legal grounds for Russia to be the United Nations member. In fact, these legal grounds do not exist. Russia has no right to inherit the place of Soviet Union as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. And it was a political decision, not a legal one. It is a well-founded opinion, because even ordinary logic, not only legal one, suggests that Russia cannot be the successor, as it likes to call itself, of the Soviet Union. These are different subjects of international law. Therefore, it is no accident that the United Nations Charter still refers to the Soviet Union, not to Russia. It is necessary to raise the issue that we do not recognize Russia as a member of the United Nations because it had no legal grounds to take the place of the USSR. If we publicly declare this, it will be the basis of our position. We will be able to call on other states, members of the UN, not to recognize Russia as a member of the UN. Why is UN system collective security destroyed, and why it failed to fulfill its key task to maintain the international peace and security? The United Nations did not succeed, did not protect us, did not help to overcome the aggression. Why then does this organization exist if it cannot protect us? This issue should be discussed. And what should be done here? Two things that mankind had not done yet. First, it is the creation of mandatory international court jurisdiction. Now there is no mandatory international jurisdiction. Everything is based on the consent of the parties. And Russia abuses and uses this situation. It does not deny international law, but on the contrary, tries to convince everyone that they are acting in accordance with international law. There is currently no mandatory jurisdiction, unless according to specific national conventions. Secondly, the problematic issue is the mechanisms of implementation of international law. We are already witnessing the process of isolation and transformation of Russia into a pariah state, into a kind of failed state. Now it is necessary to persistently and systematically work on it. Such work is already taking place both within the framework of parliamentary diplomacy and within the framework of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
You've been watching the special project by Ukraine Media Center and Euro-Atlantic course dedicated to Russia-Ukraine war, Ukraine in Flames. In description you'll find information how personally you can help Ukraine against Russian aggression. If you find our job useful, please like and share this video. Everything is gonna be Ukraine.